Fine, have
I
an
put them up.
good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the afternoon session of the final day of the Culturally Competent Conversations for Equity and Belongingness Summit. We hope you have been enjoying everything that you've been watching. We had an amazing panel discussion today on the theme for today, which is how do we go about building a culturally competent society for all of us, to have a more stable future. And so in some way or another, all of the programming and all of the sessions for today are focused on this idea of a culturally competent society, which is why this presentation now is going to be so powerful, because it touches on things that we don't normally think about that affect how we form communities in our society and how we function through those communities, and how sometimes, depending on the resources available to us, our communities actually aren't built in a way where we can thrive. And so what would it take for us to thrive? That's what this session is all about. But before I introduce our guest speaker for this session, just a couple of housekeeping notes. Whether you're watching this live or later, make sure you comment. We will be monitoring the comments even after the live summit is done, and we will make sure that the speakers get your comments and questions, especially the questions, but also any feedback you may have, because obviously as content creators and as people who are working in these spaces, your feedback is invaluable to us in helping us improve and deliver services that you need without us making assumptions. So whatever ideas, thoughts, feedback, or questions that you have, make sure you put them in the comments. And we'll make sure we respond to them, even if it's after this live summit. Last thing before I introduce our guest speaker for today, you should already know all of this by now. You should be saying it with me. This summit and future programming would not have been possible if not for all of the individual donors who have contributed. No matter how much you've contributed, thank you so much for walking the walk with me. And thank you to our partners and sponsors who believe in the dream of what and the potential of the C3EB Summit, and who are walking the walk with us toward equity, toward belongingness, and toward intentional inclusion. So huge thank you to Essential IT, my web team, my rock stars, my superstars and superhumans behind this entire technical setup. Defy the Status Quo Marketing with Ruthie Bold and Sylvia Pinho, managing our content and our social media. Our platinum sponsor, Zanzibar Enterprises, and our Pearl corporate partner, the Nielsen Company. That being said, it is my absolute thrill and pleasure to introduce to you one of my NLC family sisters and our expert speaker for today, Pascale Edouard. Pascale D. Edouard has her MPH, and she's a passionate, people-oriented public health enthusiast with an interest in advancing public health practice and addressing health disparities and inequities. Pascale earned her Master's of Public Health degree from Florida Agriculture and Mechanical University's Institute of Public Health in 2012. She's currently a doctor of public health student at the University of South Florida's College of Public Health. Ms. Edouard is currently employed as the Healthcare Services Program Manager for a local county government. She was previously employed with the Florida Department of Health for a combined 6 years, where she served as the Health Equity Coordinator. Pascale is a governing counselor with the American Public Health Association's Public Health Education and Health Promotion section, president of Manatee Bridging the Gap Incorporated, and vice chair of Gulf Coast South Area Health Education Centers. To bring light to underlying issues associated with health inequality and inequities, and to encourage collaborative engagement among public health professionals and community members, Pascale launched People of Color, or POC, Health Matters in August of 2017. The mission of POC Health Matters is to reimagine, realize, and actualize health equity among communities of color. So, as you can tell, she's highly accomplished. So, without further ado, my absolute pleasure to introduce all of you to Pascale D. Edouard, MPH. Pascale, please take it away.
Thank you, Dr. AJ. So as Dr. AJ mentioned, I'll be presenting or talking about during this workshop the intersection between racism and residential segregation and the associated health implications with the racist practice of residential segregation. So I won't belabor you again with my introduction. Dr. AJ hit it on the nose. The only difference is as of 2 weeks ago, I did pass my qualifying exams and I am now a doctoral candidate in my program. And as you may assume from the topic of this particular workshop, my research focus and interest does focus on racism and health, specifically looking at the critical race theory and applying it to public health and health disparities and inequities. And also being that I am the product of two immigrant parents, Haitian parents, my interest also lies in immigrant health statuses in the United States. So during today's workshop, I'll begin with the history of residential segregation. Then I'll delve on into social determinants of health, which I'll explain to those who may not be within the field of public health. And also, then I'll close with the associated health implications with residential segregation. So let's begin with the history of residential segregation. Residential segregation has been a practice that's been going on for centuries. I shouldn't say centuries, but decades within the United States. And essentially, it's the practice of separating or physically separating people of different races into racial homogenous neighborhoods and communities. And the practice is based on a racial hierarchy, as I'll explain a little bit later on in my slide deck or presentation. And so with this particular map, this is a redlined map, which I'll get into a little bit more. And with redlining, essentially what happened is that communities were mapped according to a color code. So here from green, yellow, blue, and red. And the green communities were the more desirable communities that white people actually got, better home lending options. And Black and Hispanic people did not get home lending opportunities, and they were relegated to the red communities where they were the more undesirable communities with low resources compared to the green mapped out communities where white people were afforded to live. So although I just touched on redlining practices, there are a lot of there are stages to residential segregation, beginning with the sundown towns. And with sundown towns, essentially what sundown towns were pre-1910, these are communities where Black people were forbidden to be in after dark. So essentially, if a Black person were caught in sundown communities or towns, their life would literally be at risk. So think about the Green Book, the movie The Green Book with traveling. A lot of Black people during this time, when they were traveling, they had to strategically plan their travel time so that they wouldn't be caught in sundown towns that forbade them from being in those towns after sunset or dark. So from sundown towns, we have racial zoning in 1910. And with racial zoning, essentially Black communities were quarantined to slums. And the reason behind this is that there was the white notion that having Black people in isolated quarantine slums would prevent the spread of diseases into white neighborhoods, and also reduce the chances of civil disturbances and protect the property value of the white majority. So despite the practice of racial zoning in 1910, in 1917, through Buchanan versus Worley, the Supreme Court struck down the practice of racial zoning. However, with all things and with people who want to keep the system the way that it is, racial zoning evolved into exclusionary zoning practices, which began in 1916. And with these exclusionary zoning practices, essentially what you have is that Black people could not afford single family homes with minimum lots, or have or also that had a minimum square feet in these communities. And the difference between racial zoning and exclusionary zoning laws is that the Supreme Court actually upheld exclusionary zoning laws in 1926's case between Euclid and Ambler. So we have the racial zoning, exclusionary zoning laws, and then now we have racially restrictive covenants. And racially restricting covenants are just pretty much an extension of exclusionary zoning practices and racial zoning laws. And with racially restrictive covenants, what happened with these practices is that if you were a white homeowner in a predominantly white community and you wished to sell your home to a Black person, you could not. You were forbidden from selling your home to a Black person during that time. And in 1926, this went to court. It went to the Supreme Court in Corrigan versus Buckley. And the Supreme Court actually upheld racially restrictive covenants as a result of, Black people who had already bought homes in predominantly white communities, they were unfortunately evicted from these homes and forced to move out of these communities. However, despite the Supreme Court upholding these laws in 1926, in 1948, in the Shelley versus Kramer Act, or Shelley versus Kramer law, the Supreme Court dismissed their original ruling, but the practice of racially restrictive covenants was so widespread that it continued. And although the Supreme Court dismissed this practice, the way that this practice was continued was through, as you can guess, violence amongst Black people who, wanted to stay in the homes that they rightfully had a right to stay in and in those communities. So the majority white population used violent practices to drive out Black homeowners in predominantly white neighborhoods. So redlining. Redlining is one of the practices that legally happened with laws in the United States for 30 plus years. And as I mentioned a little bit early on in my slide deck, redlining had to do with color-coded maps where in the more desirable communities, white people actually got home loans to live in those communities, and where Black people were denied home loans to live in the more desirable standard housing developments during that time. And also, as I mentioned too, with redlining, it was both Mexicans and Negroes, or Black people, who were put in undesirable neighborhoods or residents. So you have redlining from 1934 to 1962. However, in 1968, in the Fair Housing Act, redlining was struck down as an unjust practice, according to the Supreme Court. So despite the Supreme Court striking down the legal practice of redlining, today we still have de facto discriminatory practices that continue to happen when it comes to residential segregation in the United States. And so what we see is that African Americans or Blacks continue to encounter discrimination when it comes to looking and searching for homes at all stages of the home buying process. Black people receive subpar services. They're shown fewer homes compared to their white counterparts, and they're actually steered away. And people who are looking for homes are steered away from Black people are steered toward higher interest rates and higher risk loans, regardless of their income or credit worthiness compared to white people. And just to kind of back this up, in 2006, a study found that 53.7% of Black people and 46.6% of Hispanics applicants received high-priced loans compared to only 17.7% of white buyers or borrowers. Additionally, realtors also steer residents away from certain communities due to their racial compositions. So, for example, if I'm a black home or a black person looking for a home in a particular, well-to-do, let's say mostly white neighborhood, 9 times out of 10, a realtor who does racist practice will steer me away from that community. And the same thing, vice versa, with a white person, they'll be steered away from predominantly black communities. And interestingly enough, during my research for this presentation, I learned that in March of 2019, there was a lawsuit that was filed against Facebook, alleging that the platform allowed advertisers to use data in order to exclude racial groups from seeing home or apartment advertisements in certain neighborhoods. So, yes, we've come a long way, but there's still a lot of residential and racist practices going on within the home buying process and the practices of home selling and realtors in real estate. So, again, in 1968, the Fair Housing Act was passed. However, more than 50 years after the passing of the Fair Housing law, black and whites still remain. The residential segregation between blacks and whites still remains relatively high. And what you see here is that 56.2% of both black and white people living in the metropolitan areas would have to move in order for that area to be fully integrated. And that's what we call the similarity index, which really shows the disparate spread of black and white people, or black and Hispanic people, black and Asian people, as I'll show you in my next slide, when it comes to residential segregation and the amount of black and white, or colored people, if I should say, living in particular communities. So here with this slide, you can see that African Americans fare worst off when it comes to residential segregation, according to the similarity index. And from this arrow, the closer to 0%, the number the similarity index is, the more fully integrated it is, and the closer to 100%, the more residentially segregated it is. So you can see Asians or Asian Americans or Asians living in America live in communities that are more integrated compared to Black and Hispanic populations in the United States, especially in metropolitan areas. So let's go ahead and move on to the social determinants of health. And here I'll explain how the practice of residential segregation and racism impacts health, and how health should be contextualized. So the Western way of thinking about health is that health is a personal thing that we do, that we individually do. We're all responsible for our individual health. However, in 1995, Lincoln Phelan really stressed the importance of contextualizing health. And what they found is that there are external or distal factors that impact the health outcomes of communities, and that we shouldn't just be looking at the proximal factors that influence our health, to include, for example, healthy eating or physical activity, but we should also look at those external factors. For example, what our neighborhood environments look like, whether or not we have parks and healthy grocery stores to shop in, the crime in our neighborhood. So looking at those external factors that impact the health outcomes of populations living in those communities. They also went on in 2015 to extend their research to look at how racism and socioeconomic status impacts health, and they termed it the fundamental cause of disease theory, is what Lincoln Phelan calls this term, or the importance of contextualizing health outcomes and really looking at the distal factors. And in their research with looking at racism and the socioeconomic status of populations, they found that yes, the socioeconomic status of populations does affect the health outcomes of individuals or populations in certain communities, and racism and socioeconomic status influences the health outcomes of populations, but that also racism by itself is a fundamental cause of disease and has a negative impact on the health outcomes of populations who experience racism and the racist practices that are rooted in this American system. So you have Lincoln Phalon's The Fundamental Cause of Disease theory, right? And so with the social determinants of health, essentially what the social determinants of health is, it's an extension, if you will, of the fundamental cause of disease theory, in that it really places the importance on the conditions in which people are born, grow, live, work, and age, and how that actually impacts their health. It can either negatively or positively impact the health outcomes of populations. So the social determinants of health can include access to resources to meet our daily needs, access to education, economic and job opportunities, access to healthcare services, and also access to community-based health promoting activities and resources. So as I mentioned earlier, the social determinants of health can have either a positive or a negative impact on the health status of communities. So for example, if I live in a community that has sidewalks, parks and recreations, farmers markets, grocery stores with affordable and healthy foods, I'm more apt to have a positive health outcome because I have all those resources in my neighborhood to contribute towards me engaging in physical activity or eating healthier. So there's that aspect of it too. And then thinking about the previous slide that I showed you, if I live in a neighborhood that has access or that doesn't have access, for example, to quality schools or job opportunities, and socioeconomic opportunities, that can also negatively impact my health, because then when it comes to, for example, health literacy or being able to afford health insurance or working for a job that offers health insurance in my neighborhood, I don't have access to those things. So again, the social determinants of health can both positively or negatively impact our health depending on the resources that we have available to us in our communities. So I'm going to go ahead and round out with the health implications of residential segregation, where I will look at police brutality. I will also look at the negative implications of residential segregation. And since we're heavily in it right now, look at the negative implications of COVID-19 as a result of residential segregation. So here. So again, as I alluded to earlier on in the presentation, African Americans are the most residentially segregated population in the United States. And as a result, they're more prone to and subject to abject poverty and a lack of resources compared to their white neighborhoods. And these include exposure to environmental toxins. If we think about how most African American communities or residentially segregated communities are included in industrial parts of town where they have high smog or pollutants in the air. They're also relegated to substandard housing. And as a result, you have a high rate of African American children with asthma compared to white children. Poor quality schools. They also have access to poor or do not have access to quality economic opportunities, jobs, and also the criminal victimization. Black residentially segregated communities are overpoliced. And as a result of that, as you'll see later on in this presentation, we have higher police killings of Black individuals because we have higher encounters with police in our residentially segregated communities. And lastly, there is a correlation between the low socioeconomic status and health disparities. among Black people living in residentially segregated communities. Research has shown that the lower you are on the socioeconomic status stratum, the more likely you are to report that you have poorer health outcomes or you feel less healthy than people who have a higher socioeconomic status. So I went and just listed a couple of health disparities among Black African Americans as a result of racism and residential segregation and the racist practices that the racist institution that we all live in. So as I mentioned earlier, asthma there's a higher prevalence of asthma among Black children compared to white children. Approximately 18.6% of Black children have ever been told that they have asthma compared to 11.7% of white children. Diabetes is also higher among Black people compared to white people. 13% of Black people have diabetes compared to 8% of white people. And as we know, diabetes has to do with our healthy lifestyle behaviors. If you don't have access to healthy foods, if you don't have access to neighborhoods where you can walk and safely walk and engage in physical activity, your chances of diabetes increases. Hypertension is more than double among Black people compared to white people in the United States. And hypertension, that can be a whole presentation in and of itself due to the stress that Black people, the chronic stress, I should say, that Black people constantly experience as a result of racism and working in racist or just navigating life in a racist, systemically racist system that we live in. And then maternal and infant health is something that disproportionately impacts Black women and children in a negative way. So more Black women do not receive prenatal care than white women. They either don't receive prenatal care or they receive prenatal care at a later stage in their pregnancy compared to white women, which long term puts the child's health at risk. Not only the child's health, but the mother's health is at risk as well. So moving on to police brutality. With this particular graph, I wanted to show, just combined, communities of color have a higher number of police killings compared to white people in the United States, period. So you can see there's a disproportionate amount of communities of colors or members of communities of color who have died at the hands of police in urban geographies compared to white people in the United States. And this is from 2013 through 2019. And with this particular slide, I really wanted to show the disparities within communities of color when it comes to police killings. You can see, compared to the Asian and the Native American and Pacific Islander community, Black and Hispanic people have higher incidences of police killings compared to Asians and Native American and Pacific Islanders. However, just looking at the number of killings, police killings of Black people compared to the Hispanic population, you can see that it's almost double that of the Hispanic population. And as we know from the deaths of Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Brother Blake, Brother George, and all the others known and unknown that have been killed by the hands of police, this is an issue that is of such importance that we need to deal with throughout the United States. And moving on to COVID-19, again, as I mentioned, since we're in it, we might as well focus on the disparities that exist with COVID-19. So here you can see that the cases of COVID-19, generally speaking, impacts American Indians and Alaskan Natives, Asians, Black and African Americans, and Hispanics relatively at the same degree, especially when you look at Asians, American Indians, and Alaskan Natives, Hispanics, and Blacks, or maybe not Asians. Asians have a lower incident of cases. However, with hospitalizations, you can see the trend still follows, where there are higher numbers of hospitalizations among the American Indian and Alaskan Native populations, the Black population, and the Hispanic population. But when you look at the deaths, that's where you really see the disparity. There are more Black people dying as a result of COVID-19 compared to American Natives and American Indians and Alaskan Natives and Hispanics. And one of the reasons, or some of the reasons that we can attribute the high death rates of African Americans are because of those underlying causes of disease or chronic diseases. However, this has been known forever. And it's nothing new. We've known that Black people have suffered from chronic diseases at disproportionate rates compared to our Hispanic counterparts and our American Indian and Alaskan Native counterparts. But if you look at the communities that we all live in, this is a direct correlation. When you look at the residentially segregated communities that we live in and the lack of access to healthcare services, the lack of access to economic opportunities, and how in these residentially segregated communities we live in, or African Americans live in compact. Like if you think about, for lack of a better word, what was once called like ghettos, if you will. We literally live on top of each other within close proximity. So of course the spread of coronavirus and the death toll of coronavirus among the Black community is going to be higher compared to those communities who do not live on top of each other and aren't so much in close proximity. And so just to round out this presentation and with some concluding remarks regarding residential segregation, residential segregation has been going on for decades. And it's not by mistake this has happened. As you saw or can allude to from the historical data that I presented earlier, this is all by design. And so we really, really need to look at these racist practices and policies and address them. And so how do we address them? And this is a tall order as far as recognizing them, addressing them, and dismantling them. So we really have to, again, look at the long history and legacy of generations of residential segregation in America and how it's negatively impacted the Black population or the Black community disproportionately. And when I like to think of, we're well overdue for our 40 acres in a mule. We put in our time, we damn near built this country, if you will. And so it's time to really look at the racist practices and how we can undo them. And then in addition to looking at the long history of residential segregation and racist practices in the United States, we also have to look at the contemporary racial and residential practices in the United States in regards how the real estate industry discriminates, how the real estate industry does discriminatory or de facto discriminatory racist practices when it comes to the home buying process against Black and African Americans. And then we also need to look at and address the ongoing economic discrimination among Black and African Americans. As we all know, or some of us may know, that home buying is one of the ways we build wealth. And so if Black people are not afforded the same rights and the same ability as, other racial and ethnic groups, when it comes to the home buying process, we're always going to be at a disadvantage when it comes to building wealth in our communities and among our population. So these are some of the things that I think we need to begin to look at when it comes to addressing residential segregation and also addressing the health disparities and outcomes among the Black and Hispanic population as a whole. So this I think is my last slide, and this concludes my presentation. I thank you all and welcome any questions that you may all have.
Hi, I'm Ruthie, and I loved your presentation.
Thank you.
It was like seeing my company did the content for the summit. So all of the blog posts and everything, that was us. And I was the primary researcher and writer for those. And so every time I did another blog post, it was, I knew these things, but like to actually go in and look at the numbers, it was like seeing how much they overlap and play into each other. It was wonderful to see your presentation because it was like a more solid version of the realization I had by the time I finished the last blog post, which was on environmental equity, and so the topic for that one was the air pollution inequities.
Yes.
And I was actually talking to my husband about it and talking about how more Black children are reported to have asthma, and it's like, well, it's probably because they consume or intake a lot more pollution.
Right.
When compared to other children. So I think I cannot wait to share the link for your presentation for the people who are just like, systemic what? It's not systemic. What are you talking about?
And it is. And I think too, like, we really have to like address the ignorance behind it. I think, and this is a start with the summit. Like, a lot of people just don't know, don't care to know, or, honestly are ignorant of the systemic issues that exist when it comes to racism, and how the system honestly wasn't built for people of color. But we know this now. So how do we make the system work for people of color? I think is what we really need to get to the root of.
I did have a question. So there's been something new kind of circulating on Facebook as a few articles have come out on the instances of homes owned by Black people or interracial families being appraised at lower numbers and then being reappraised once all traces of Blackness have been removed. And I was curious as to your thoughts on that, especially as it integrates with everything else that you're talking about here.
Yes, I actually saw that post on Facebook, and I want to say I'm at disbelief, but I'm not. And I guess like I have more questions than I do answers to that in regards to like, what's so inherently wrong about having a Black person or an interracial couple having lived in the house that you're buying that they will no longer live in again. Like, so I have more questions in regards to that because to me it doesn't make sense.
I have to wonder if it's some sort of unconscious bias that Black people or interracial families who have, Black family members just don't have as much money. So how could they have a house that's worth the same as the white family's house next door? I don't know.
Yeah, that one I'm still trying to figure out. I was taken aback by it. I was just like, wow.
Yes. And actually, I ended up engaging on a post because a white person said that they had it happen to them as well. So it wasn't a race issue. And so I got on her and I got on her comment and said that just because it also happens to white people does not mean it does not disproportionately happen to Black people. And I told her, even if it didn't disproportionately happen to Black people, if it happened to her because, and the reason wasn't because she was white, but then it happens to a Black person and the reason is because they are Black, then it is still a problem.
Exactly.
Because it was still because of their race. So even if it wasn't a disproportionate effect, which it is, it still wouldn't matter if it was still based on their race. So, and I live in a white majority neighborhood. And so, and my husband and I are both veterans. So we actually used a VA loan to purchase our home. So I have to wonder, and I was on the loan as well. So, and of course, people saw me. So I have to wonder if the fact that we were able to use a VA loan might have helped us kind of circumnavigate some of those issues.
Yeah, and I do want to talk. Well, before I even respond to what you just said, can I stop sharing my screen so I can see you talk to you?
Oh
Or
yeah,
do you want me to
on
leave
my
screen
end, you're
on?
not sharing your screen anymore.
Oh, really? Okay, because all I see is my slides. So how do I? Okay, maybe here it is.
I think you
Okay,
stopped
there you
sharing. Yeah.
go. Okay. But yeah, too, with your point in regards to like the VA loans, a lot of with like redlining, the legal practice of redlining, a lot of the GIs, the Black GIs who came back to the United States looking to buy homes, although they, did service on behalf of the United States, they were denied loans and couldn't even buy homes in like newly developed communities because of the simple fact that they were Black. So that just kind of came to mind when you said that, you were afforded the opportunity to buy a home because you and your husband are veterans. But there was a time in history where, Black people, despite the fact, we fought for this country as well, we could not buy homes in newly developed subdivisions. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and then also our home is not in like an HOA. It's by no stretch of the imagination like new. It isn't an expensive area, but we're zoned rural agricultural. So it just kind of gets my wheels turning as I wonder like kind of what would have happened, let's say, if we were trying to move into a newer subdivision, an HOA with, all of its rules and stuff. But yeah, in that sense, we were lucky. I wanted farm animals and stuff, so I couldn't live in an HOA. But yes, just thank you so much for that. And I'm really looking forward, like I said, to sharing that. I think the big thing is that a presentation like yours doesn't just inform people who refuse to see the realities of our existence, but it also better informs people who already care, like myself and like many of the people
Right.
I know. And that's one of the big things that I've taken away from being professionally involved, but also personally involved with Dr. AJ, is that I've always felt that she has allowed me to better explain or given me the words to better explain not just my experience, but the actual experiences of other people like me, not like me. But what we have in common is that, we
Yes.
have inequitable opportunities and have to work hard to have equitable opportunities. Not really equitable if you have to work 2 times as hard to get it. So
Yes,
so
ma'am.
thank you so much for that. It feels like a Venn diagram in my mind of all these overlaying issues that all play their part, between air pollution and health indicators and COVID, and then residential, discrimination,
Yeah.
along with financial inequities. And it's mind blowing. And sometimes it's like, it's a wonder that we even managed to get anything done in the first place.
Yeah, it's like literally you got to peel back the layers, and it's like it's not going to take. It's nothing that's going to happen overnight. I think it's like a tall order. When we talk about dismantling racism, I know it won't be done in our lifetimes. Like I was, for example, watching on Instagram Dr. King's granddaughter speaking at the March on Washington, and literally I cried, and I'm like, although the work that we're collectively doing we may not benefit from it, but I pray and I hope that she'll benefit from it, and her kids will benefit from it as well. So I think I'm really fortunate, and I'm really excited to see where these summits go, because these conversations are so important. They need to be had.
Yes.
For those, not only those of us who want to learn more, but those of us, like I said, who are ignorant to it, truly ignorant to it, but want to learn more, and those of us who may just don't want to know, but maybe might hear from those who are allies and really pushing the message out in regards to systemic racism and how it affects people of color in the United States.
For sure. And I mean, I guess when you think about it, in the March on DC, we've all benefited from the work that Martin Luther King Jr. did. So I guess that just shows that we're going in the right direction.
Yes, right, we are.
Well, thank you so much for that. Man, today has just been a day. I felt like I've seen so many just like such good ones today. I mean, they were all great, but I don't know what it is about Friday. Maybe it's just because I know that today is the last day of this first inaugural C3EB Summit experience. And maybe I'm just kind of feeling the emotions from the whole 3 days today. I'm not sure, but thank you so much for being a part of this.
No problem. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Very much so grateful for your time. And thank you again to all of our sponsors. If you are currently watching this, or if you're watching this as a replay, be sure to check out the other sessions that we have. Feel free to connect with our lovely presenter here today, but also any of the presenters that we've had during the entire summit. And we look forward to seeing you at the closing keynote and for Dr. AJ's closing notes as well. Be sure to catch any of the other sessions that are still going right now. Thank you so much for everybody for being here today.
Thank you, Ruthie.
You're welcome.